Welcome to the Great Irish Famine Voices documentary 2022. It's made possible by the National Famine Museum at Strokestown Park, the Irish Heritage Trust and St. Michael's College, Toronto, funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs. We can have no better guide to this story than Professor Mark McGowan. He spent many years looking to the records of Strokestown Park, and in particular the correspondence of Denis Mahon, the landlord at the time of Black 47, the very worst year of the Great Famine. And Denis Mahon is trying to do two things at once. He's trying to clear his estate so that it can be more economically productive by moving from essentially tillage to pasturage. But he's also trying to find a home for some of the 11,000 tenants that are on his vast estate. And he does this in a scheme of emigration to British North America, which is Upper Canada, and what would become Canada. He's been vilified in the past because of this. Many of them did indeed die on the passage and so on, and on Grosse Ile and other reception centres in Canada. But Mark has discovered from the correspondence that in fact in one reading of it, Denis Mahon took great care to make sure they were properly provided for and that they did indeed have a life in Canada. And many of them did create a life in Canada. It was hard in those first generations. They were canal builders. They helped build the Rideau Canal in the 1830s, the Lachine Canal, and the Welland Canal in the 1840s and 1850s, and also the Victoria Bridge, for example, of Montreal. These were major infrastructural developments that helped create modern Canada. In subsequent generations, of course, the Irish moved up the social and economic ladder. They became soldiers in the British Army in Canada. They became farmers. They became business people. Obviously, clergymen too came over. And they became politicians, most famously Thomas D'Arcy McGee, one of the founding fathers of Canadian Confederation in 1867. But what Mark manages to do is to combine historical accuracy through the records with telling the human story of some of those emigrants, their families and their fates in Canada. It's a fascinating journey and I know you'll enjoy it.
I'm Mark McGowan. I'm a historian at St. Michael's College in the University of Toronto, and I'm here in Roscommon, Ireland, on the estate of Denis Mahon. The estate house is behind me. Denis Mahon became notorious as a landlord in the 1840s during the Great Irish Famine because he removed about 1,490 of his tenants, 271 families, in an assisted migration scheme that was to take them to British North America, and specifically the port of Quebec. He and his land agent, John Ross Mahon, actually hatched the scheme, and at the end it was reported that on board those ships that he had essentially provisioned and paid for the passage of these tenants, that they were among the most horrendous coffin ships in the North Atlantic during the sailing season of 1847. In particular, the Naomi and the Virginius lost close to half the complement on board the ship. Denis Mahon was blamed for this, and in November of 1847 he became the first landlord to be assassinated in Ireland during the context of the famine. Searching the historical records, however, will give you a sense that it's a very one-sided story. What makes me interested in this is essentially what happens to these people. We can put faces on this sort of faceless proletariat that has been transported across the Atlantic, and my job over the last decade has been trying to, in a sense, archaeologically bring them out of the mists of the past and restore some sense of what what happened to them. Close to 60 orphans from this estate actually end up in North America. Others, some 160 families, are scattered, both in what is now the provinces of Quebec and Ontario, and later into the Midwest of the United States.
I think one of the things that when we're exploring the emigration scheme from the Denis Mahon estate at Strokestown in County Roscommon in 1847 is that the documents tend to be housed both in the Strokestown Park Archive, a very, very rich collection, but also in the National Library of Ireland. And from that manuscript division of the National Library, we have now digitized documents that are extraordinarily helpful and can be reunited with the collection at Strokestown Park, which will assist researchers. Now, for my own part, I've been working on the emigration scheme for several years, and there are a number of documents that I'd like to highlight with you, just to give you a sense of how important the correspondence between Major Denis Mahon, the landlord, and his agent on the estate, John Ross Mahon, were to the understanding of this particular assisted immigration scheme. I mean, there were many assisted immigration schemes across Ireland during the famine, several in County Sligo on the estate of Gore Booth and on the estate of Lord Palmerston. There was the estate of Fitzwilliam in Wicklow, and also Lansdowne in County Kerry. But each one of these tells a different story about landlord motivations and about the way in which the tenants were equipped for their assisted journey to British North America or the United States. I mean, one of the documents that was between land agent and Major Mahon in March of 1847 was the preference of the landlord to have small holders be the ones assisted off the estate. Now, much can be drawn from this kind of examination, that smallholders, for example, were the ones who were largely in arrears. There was also the debate among landlords themselves as to how to consolidate these many small holdings that were in arrears during the famine to create large pasturages for the more profitable agricultural activity of animal husbandry. So this letter sort of signals where Denis Mahon wants to focus the assisted migration scheme. And it's not something that he does willy-nilly. There's a document from April 8th, 1847, that offer us a glimpse into the kind of details that Mahon wanted before actually sending any of his tenants to Canada. And this is a question and answer document that he sends, trying to get the best information he can in terms of fares, in terms of supplies, in terms of prices, and in terms of places from which his people could sail. So it wasn't a matter of throwing caution to the wind and leaving it up to his agent. He was involved with the scheme from the very beginning, from its inception and right through to its execution through Liverpool. And that's why the document is rather interesting. In April of 1847, again, just 5 days after the document that I last talked about, is that Denis Mahon didn't want to send his tenants through Liverpool. He thought it would be more convenient and closer for them to go from Roscommon to neighboring county of Sligo and sail out of Sligo town, which had been the place of departure for the assisted immigration schemes on the Palmerston estate and the Gore Booth estate. But it's interesting that there's an interplay between himself and the agent, John Ross Mahon, who has better connections with Liverpool. And we find through other documentation that the original plan that Denis Mahon had to send his tenants through Sligo, which would have been far more practical by his accounting, actually was thwarted by his land agent, who had ties to the Robinson brothers, who were shipping agents out of Liverpool. That being said, there's a document, a letter again, signed by Denis Mahon on May the 24th, that indicates he was now dealing with the Robinson brothers. And this letter is important because it itemizes the extra stores and supplies that he would provide on board ship. There were many accusations both during the famine and afterwards in both the historical literature and the popular literature that somehow landlords basically herded their tenants on board these coffin ships and sent them without proper supplies to Canada and the United States. This letter suggests otherwise, that Mahon had taken the time to itemize what supplies would be needed in addition to those already provided by the ship to sustain his tenants on their 6-week voyage across the Atlantic. So a very important document. Another document of note is actually what happens to those who remain on the estate. And in this particular case, this letter of March 7th from Denis Mahon to his land agent once again refers to the landlord's effort to try to provide those who are on the estate and will be staying on the estate supplies of seed. Free seed for those who can't afford it to plant crops for the coming season, and seed at a modest price for those who could afford it. And it's a very important distinction because in a letter written earlier by Denis Mahon on January 3rd, 1847, he distinguishes between several types of tenants on his estate. The ones who are destitute that he really wants to help, either in situ or to become part of a plan which hasn't materialized at this point, the scheme. Other tenants who are middlemen who should be paying their rents but are slow in paying their rents, probably because those whom they sublet to have been unable to pay during the famine crisis. But what he singles out are those tenants that can pay and won't pay and appear to be in conspiracy not to pay. And those are the tenants that he wants to punish. Those are the tenants that will not participate or not be able to participate in any of his schemes, whether they be the upcoming scheme of transportation to North America or the planting schemes that he has in place. So he discerns between several different kinds of tenants, and I think this is a very important document for the distinctions that Denis Mahon wants to make about those who are living on his estate. And there are close to 11,000 tenants on his estate in 1847. I think finally, a very important document for the purposes of the scheme itself is a letter that is signed by Denis Mahon to his agent on June the 15th, 1847. And it talks about the second batch of migrants. So all told, there were 270 families in the emigration scheme that we know of. The first batch left in late May on board the ships Erin's Queen and the notorious coffin ship, the Virginius, and the second batch left shortly thereafter in early June on the ships Naomi and John Munn. And this letter pinpoints the kind of payments that were made to the Robinson brothers through Denis Mahon's ability to raise money while in England preparing for the emigration scheme. So this second batch is nicely documented in this letter according to the costs of the voyage itself. And I think all 7 letters really indicate the kind of care and concern that Denis Mahon actually had, that this emigration scheme would at least provide a better opportunity for his tenants in North America. And I think that's one interpretation of these letters. There are probably many more, and I think that's up to the researcher to try to squeeze these documents for the interpretation that best fits the evidence. I think there's a final document that we might raise attention to, and it really is also in the National Library of Ireland collection, recently discovered and digitized, and it's a ledger of tenants, their rent, reflecting in many ways what happens on the estate after the migration scheme. The first document is dated 1849 and is addressed to Mrs. Mahon, who at this point is a widow because Denis Mahon was assassinated in early November 1847. And so what has happened is John Ross Mahon and the successors to the estate are now reevaluating those tenants who were there. And I would like to highlight the marginal comments that are made in the ledger, referring to tenants who are unwilling to pay, tenants who are essentially expelled from the estate, and the reasons for that. So a very important glimpse into the way in which the estate was managed in a time after the emigration scheme, and also with the expulsion of tenants being at the forefront. And this is often the lens that we look back through to see some of the worst folly of the landlords, that the taking of lands, the expropriation of those tenants' lands, again by the landlord, and the thrusting of these not immigrants, but tenants out onto the highways and the byways of Ireland to fend for themselves. These are the tragic stories of the famine, and we read those writ large in these ledgers from post-1847 on the Mahon estate.